Last lecture we discussed feudalism, that response to the chaos in Europe that was caused by the collapse of the Roman Empire and the need for security, justice, and government that arose when the Roman imperial system ceased to function. We saw that an organization of society developed based upon the production of not just administrative units, but also of protective units that allowed individuals to have some measure of security. However, we also saw that it was very local in nature and that the idea of the state itself began to fragment into the localities. But feudalism is a broad concept. It is something that is an artificial structure that is imposed upon the functioning of a society that gives it a kind of meaning. It is a kind of pyramid with the theoretical overlord at the top, at the apex, and then those who do the work of the world as the base, and everyone else in between, with elements of mutual obligation ensuring that society functions. But then, like all constructs, we really need to break it down to ensure that there is much more understanding of how society actually functioned. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at the tripartite structure of European society during the Middle Ages to see, in fact, how this system actually worked and how the social organization of Europe provided not just government and security, but also met most of the needs of most of the population at a time when money did not circulate, when there was no central authority, and in which life was really local, and you lived on the manner in which you were born, and you protected those that needed protection, and you provided honor and a product to those who needed it as well. So in fact, if we look at medieval society, we can see that it is divided really into three functionally defined groups, or estates. The etymology of estate is interesting in itself because it comes from the past participle of the verb to be, which means then we're talking about conditions of being. These were states of existence. They weren't social classes determined only by economics or by social prestige or privilege. They were considered part of the divine plan. God had you born in a particular group in order to fulfill particular functions in order to ensure that his plan would be worked out on earth. This meant that social mobility of any kind was extremely difficult. It also meant that this organization, this pyramidal structure, this feudal system was seen indeed as divinely ordained. And again, it was as a result very conservative and lasted a very long time indeed. Now, the three estates of medieval society were the first estate of the clergy. This was the group that paved men and women's way into heaven. They provided spiritual comfort. They provided the necessity of ecclesiastical operations such as the saying of Mass, the burying of the dead, the marrying of young people, and the baptism of children. These were necessary functions in the Christian religion, and they were necessary social adhesives. They kept society together, and it was part of the shared culture of a society that was divided, to be sure, into classes and groups, but nevertheless they all had some elements in common that gave them a common shared vocabulary and experience, and religion provided this to a very great degree. The second estate was the estate of the nobility. The nobility we have already discussed at length. The nobility consisted of those knights who were able to fight on horseback. They were the ones that provided administration. They were the ones that provided protection. They were the ones who provided justice. This estate of the nobility then was the natural ruling class. They ruled according to the rules of feudalism, according to their obligations to their greater lords, and fulfilled obligations to those beneath them. The reality was, in this highly fragmented world of the exercise of power, that really the locality mattered, and what the feudal lord on his own estates could get away with, he often did. And so consequently, the idea of nobility, the idea of chivalry that we talked about last time, was something that was just as often honored in the breach than in the practice. But nevertheless, it was an important concept. It was an important concept because it allowed for this privileged group to exercise power and authority with the acceptance of the other groups in society, as long as they fulfilled their function. And this function, of course, was primarily the provision of protection. It was also the provision of some measure of administration at a time when the Roman imperial system no longer functioned, and when the theoretical overlord of the king or the prince or whoever had the honor of sitting at the apex of that pyramid of feudalism could not exercise power because of the complexity of the world in which he lived. So the nobility then was an important class and was functionally defined. But increasingly, because it was much easier and in some ways almost more appropriate to ensure that your sons were trained in the family business of fighting on horseback and exercising justice, that it became hereditary. Initially, feudalism allowed for the contract to be fulfilled by anyone capable of doing so. But increasingly, the idea of nobility, the idea of being part of this privileged elite, was passed on through bloodline. And so then, what was a necessary class providing a necessary function in a time of chaos became, in fact, a closed caste based on birth. And increasingly then, we must see the second estate of the nobility as not just functionally defined, but defined by an accident of birth. If you were born into that class, you had certain privileges simply as a consequence of that birth. The third estate. The third estate really consisted of everybody else. The third estate, depending on when and where in Europe, represented between 85 and 95% of the population. These were the people who worked, who provided the labor that made society operate, that provided the food that was put on everyone's table, that provided the building of churches, that did almost everything that ensured that society would in fact work in some way. These people worked by continuous labor, and because they worked with the labor of their own hands, they lacked any privilege or status. The nobility and clergy lived in leisure through the labor of others. The third estate provided that labor and, as a consequence, had no privilege and had no status. The third estate was a very complex group because it was not just the peasants in the field, although they constituted by far the greatest number. There were also the artisans in the town. They also were those who worked in the mercantile world that was beginning to develop. And there were also the servants and others who performed those tasks because the clergy and the nobility needed their work in order to ensure their leisure. So the first two estates, we have to simply assume, lived in leisure. The third estate by constant hard work. And those who did work did not benefit greatly from it. In fact, they put in the greatest effort, but received in many ways the least reward. We've seen the second estate then in operation. Let's now have a look at the first estate of the clergy. The first estate of the clergy was a very interesting group because it was in theory a meritocracy. The clergy would grow because those who were attracted either to a religious life or those who were placed there by their families felt that they could make a contribution to the well-being of the souls of Europe. The reality was, of course, is that there was a differentiation in that second class of the clergy. It wasn't one class, in fact. It was variegated and divided by all kinds of divisions that really did indicate that it was not just a meritocracy, but it was, in fact, reflective of that feudal structure divided by class, by caste, and by occupation. To think, in fact, of the higher clerics, those who actually exercised power, bishops, archbishops, and others, these were powerful lords. They were feudal lords of vast estates. They, after all, were usually feudal lords who had obligations to those above and those below. The exercise of power, the ownership of land, and the power that came with the ownership of land and those who worked on it was seen to be the unique monopoly of the knightly class, that second estate of the nobility. And consequently, most of the great clerics, the bishops, the archbishops, and the abbots of large abbeys, tended to come from that class. It is, of course, a reasonable thing, because not only was the society structured so that these individuals would exercise a power that they believed was theirs by birth and by right, but also because of the way the feudal system worked in itself. Anyone who owned an estate, who had feudal obligations, had to fulfill those obligations. And those obligations were various in form. There were, for example, the needs of providing administration. Bishops, of course, could do that very easily. They were educated and they had the skills to administer. They could provide justice, that as well. And occasionally, they could even provide military assistance. The feudal obligations of providing military help to your overlord apply just as much to a clerical estate as to a secular estate. So when we see in the Chanson de Roland, for example, Archbishop Turpin fighting beside the knights trying to stop the Islamic invasions from Spain, we realize, in fact, that this whole world was one of interdependent and mutually supportive roles, all based on class and function as well as on the distinction between clerical and secular, which in fact was very blurred. The use of clerics in various forms in this feudal system, because, as I say, they were feudal lords, meant a certain set of assumptions that became very dangerous when seen in terms of the obligations of clerics towards the church, towards the faithful, and towards their primary function, which is helping the faithful achieve salvation. If, for example, you are responsible for administration of justice, if you're responsible for administration, you're responsible for military activity, a man who was too spiritual, who was too ascetic, who avoided the world, would in fact be essentially useless. These kinds of men were better suited to monastic life rather than to the high offices of the church. Consequently, the church was largely run by people not only of the knightly class, of that aristocratic group who assumed power belonged to them by birth, but by those who were ambitious in themselves, those who wanted to exercise power and saw the church as a mechanism for doing so. We will see how complex this will become later when this kind of internal contradiction would work itself out in the crises of the church and ultimately helping lead to the events of the Reformation. Indeed, the best example is probably that of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket. Thomas à Becket was a close boon companion of the English King Henry II, and as long as they were friends, things went well. And in fact, they were such close friends, and Henry wanted more control of the church that he nominated his friend Thomas to become Archbishop of Canterbury. However, when Thomas was consecrated archbishop, he no longer became the king's creature. He began to accept some of the responsibilities for his clerical life, some of the duties towards the faithful and to the organization of the church at the expense of the crown, that Henry lost patience with him and then uttered those fateful words of, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome, troublesome priest?" And some of his knights heard, and of course Thomas à Becket was murdered in front of the altar of his cathedral at Canterbury, becoming an English martyr. This example indicates the nature of the complexity of power in the Middle Ages. The mutual obligations, the complete blurring of authority between the secular and the religious, between the aristocratic and the clerical, and amongst individuals who often held different sorts of power simultaneously, and those altogether who were part of this ruling structure who held public power in private hands. All of this indicates that a system that originally arose to respond to chaos would not function well in a more sophisticated environment, one where these internal contradictions were in fact continually being revealed, and where tensions could arise, and tensions could lead to not just individual failure, but in fact the events of civil war or institutional breakdown. There were, besides the great clerics, there were the monks and nuns. There were those who chose, or had chosen for them, a life that was separate from the world. In theory, monks and nuns rejected the world. In fact, in many instances, and in some elements of law, living monks and nuns were dead in law because they were not part of this world. Monks and nuns then were in theory the real ascetics, those who were looking for comfort for their own souls and to be examples for others through help and assistance or through constant prayer. This, of course, was the theory. The reality, again, as in any society, tended to be very different. First of all, monasteries were themselves great lordships. Pious donors gave vast estates to great abbeys so that the abbots were in fact powerful feudal lords in themselves. Remember that again in England in the Parliament, the mitred abbots sat with the bishops and the archbishops in the estate of the House of Lords. So in fact, the abbeys, the monasteries and convents were not places of escaping from the world. They were built right into the world and the fundamental secular functions of the world because of this ambiguity of the feudal system, which gave the ownership of land an enormous power. Those who owned the land had power over the people who lived on it and had obligations that had to be fulfilled. And again, many of these obligations were in contradistinction to the intention of the institution itself, and the monastic world being a fine example. It was not only that, but the fact that in many instances, Roman law required that the land of a nobleman be divided equally amongst his living sons, with some provision as well for his living daughters. In a family that had too many sons, the danger of dividing the land and consequently weakening through fragmentation the power of the family in the locality meant that it was not a wise decision to provide all sons with a secular living. As a result, then, the richer monasteries, the aristocratic monasteries, became the dumping ground for surplus children. The reasons for this, of course, should be obvious. Monks and nuns cannot produce legitimate children, and so their line, their collateral lines, ended with them. The other reason was that it provided a comfortable life for these surplus children. They weren't able to work, they had no other option in life, so at least a monastery would give them a community and give them a status and give them a rank. And obviously, for those aristocratic families who put their surplus children in convents and monasteries, their very rank and the influence and memory of their names would help them rise to become the abbots and abbesses and to have enormous power in themselves. This, of course, was a problem, because large numbers of monks and nuns, especially those, again, who would rise to high office because of their families, had no vocation. They had no desire whatsoever to live lives of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were put there because they were surplus children of an aristocratic family. Monasteries and convents required smaller dowries, so it cost families less. And the result was that these monasteries began to grow in number and grow in size. And the beginnings of the legends of amoral and immoral activity began to creep into popular imagination. That legend of the nun of Monza, that woman who ultimately was sealed alive in the walls of her convent because of her constant sexual dalliance with priests and others, became part of popular legend, and the idea then of convents and monasteries as being sacred and special places tended to some extent to be divided from reality. This too would have significance. It would have significance with the coming of the Reformation, but it would have significance even earlier, when some of the elements of popular belief and popular faith among common people began to be diluted by these legends of immorality and inappropriate behavior. Finally, in discussing the first estate of the clergy, we have to talk about the parish priest. Those who actually ministered to the faithful, those who actually provided most of the services that the vast majority of the European population identified as those necessary functions in order to achieve salvation. That is, those who said Mass, those who baptized, those who married, and those who buried. The parish priests tended to come from the social group to whom they ministered. So if the parish priest had a rural parish on the fringes of Europe consisting of peasants, the priest would be of that class himself. Often he would be poorly trained, in some instances illiterate, but nevertheless he had an important function. But it was not a function that really had much secular privilege attached to it. His reputation was purely clerical because of the mystery of the Mass and because of what his sacramental role was. He had no money and lived on either the tithes of the community, which were small if the community were poor, by taking fees for marrying, burying, and baptizing. But essentially, he was always to be branded with the inferiority of low birth. And consequently, the theory of the church as a meritocracy began again to fail. What we see then is that the church really did in many ways parallel the feudal system itself. It was hierarchical in structure, and those examples, and powerful and useful as they are, of poor men who reached the highest offices in the church, provided always an example. There was, of course, the memory of St. Peter the fisherman, but there was also the memory that it was extremely difficult for anyone who had not owned and administered property to do so simply because of ordination into the clergy. Still, though, this was an important memory to sustain, the idea that the church could provide some kind of social escalator. And there were those who used it for exactly that. We think, for example, of the famous and learned polymath Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, whose father was a boatman on the Rhine. But then we also think of others, the anti-Pope John the 23rd, who began life as a highwayman and brigand. So in fact, the models were there, the legends were there, the belief in a community that the complexity of the world could be reflected in the institutions that governed them. This was part of the inheritance of medieval Europe. A complex world with mutually exclusive ideas built upon mutually interdependent relationships. It was built upon that public power in private hands that leads to all kinds of difficulty, and it led to the blending of the sacred and the profane that caused a good deal of discomfort, especially amongst those that could not see how complex the situation of those above them really had to be. The Third Estate. The Third Estate was really 90% of the population of Europe, and it was a complex group in itself. First of all, simply being born into the Third Estate meant that you were born without privilege or prestige, and the vast majority of members of that estate consisted of agricultural laborers, peasants, who were bound more or less to the soil that they tilled. Life was uncertain for these agricultural workers, and the disasters of disease, of famine, of war were always there to destroy them and their families. The belief that somehow you were being protected was in fact a fleeting one. Your Lord could protect your body if there should be invasion, but the Lord could do nothing if the famine should come or if disease should descend upon the village. So life was uncertain and life was insecure. But nevertheless, there were some elements that did provide security and comfort, ones that were very difficult for us to understand. First of all, there was very, very little mobility, either social or physical. Medieval agriculture was in fact cooperative, and so people had to be kept where they were. And as a result, many of the agricultural laborers, especially during the early and the beginning of the High Middle Ages, were attached to the soil in one way or another. And we will talk about this more in detail when we look at the manorial economy. Nevertheless, there were some elements of physical mobility. Towns were beginning to grow, there were opportunities elsewhere, but essentially it was extremely unlikely that any of these opportunities would be taken. First of all, they weren't readily available. When you were born into a circumstance in which the manner in which you lived was the entirety of your life, it was a great challenge to get up and leave, especially since, according to your obligations, you weren't supposed to. And those obligations were not just to the landlord, but also to your fellow peasants, because as we'll see in a subsequent lecture, medieval agriculture was cooperative and collective. It wasn't based upon individual labor. The other thing that we have to remember is that there was something that was quite comforting about being part of this community. Although there was no status, no privilege, no wealth associated with working the land, there was in fact a directness and the immediacy of a community of people who shared the existence of your life. This was a culture of its own, and the idea of a culture of the medieval agricultural worker, which often is seen negatively through the eyes of their social superiors and through a literature, as we've said, dominated by the privileges and the perspectives of the nobility. Nevertheless, there was a culture there, and a culture, in fact, that did provide some measure of comfort and security to those who lived within it. The agricultural laborer, then, was in fact not in any way a privileged or an advantaged group. But nevertheless, they did most of the labor of the continent, and they produced the food that made sure that society could function, and they were in fact that platform in which the entire feudal pyramid was built. Then there are the urban classes. The urban classes during the early Middle Ages were relatively small, at least in Northern Europe. These were individuals who either had grown and stayed in cities from ancient times, and in the Italian peninsula there was urban life and unbroken succession from the earliest times, and cities had never altogether ceased. But then there were others who chose to leave the manor and enter these towns or cities for one reason or another. Occasionally driven by economic circumstance of overpopulation in the countryside, but usually through a kind of ambition, through a kind of desire to be greater than or better than the village would allow. So it can be suggested then that one reason that cities and towns became such dynamic places is that because they were the choice residence of those people with the ambition and the energy and the courage to actually escape the manor and go to the town and begin to build something quite different based upon their own labor rather than the collectivity of the manorial responsibility. The urban classes, moreover, constituted a very, very broad section of humanity, and every group from an economic and a privilege basis, in fact, tended to be represented. There were at the bottom the servants and those who did the low trades that were associated with every town and village, everything from the collecting of manure from the cities in order to sell it, to be spread on the fields around the town, to those who functioned as personal servants. But then above them, there were the artisans, often well-paid, highly trained, collected in guilds in order to ensure that there would be not only a certain quality of production, but also a control of material and prices and entry. These artisans earned good wage. They were in fact respected, and within the town they had a role to play that was seen as honored. Above them were the professionals, those lawyers and physicians and others who had learning and fulfilled the needs of any complex society to ensure that there were enforceable contracts and to make sure that there was some measure of legality and some measure of health in the very uncertain world that also included towns and cities. And above them were the vastly wealthy merchants, international merchants and those who made fortunes from banking and trade. We'll discuss this group at another time because their importance became extraordinary once towns and villages began to separate from what really amounted to the feudal structure itself. Because what we have to remember is that towns and cities really had no place within this structure. The feudal system didn't really allow for men who were wealthy, highly educated, and secular, who were not noble. If you owned wealth and power, then in fact you had to be a member of that privileged nobility. That's the way the feudal system worked. So then these rich burghers, these bankers and merchants who had significant wealth did not really fit. And in fact, it's the struggle to find a place within this preordained structure of European society that constitutes one of the dynamic of change in European history, as we will see. Trying to determine exactly where these wealthy, educated, influential townsmen actually fit became in fact one of the engines that drove the development of European civilization, and we will discuss it at some great length. The other reality is that those within the towns had to make sure that their protection would be their own. Who owned cities and towns? To whom were they really responsible? Were they in fact part of the manorial system because most of them had grown from villages that had been on a manor in somebody's feudal territory? Or were they separate? Did they have an existence in law and an existence in practice outside the feudal system? This too is going to be one of those dynamics we'll investigate to see how in fact the legal structure of towns changed the identification of what constituted power, and how in fact society operated in order to define who was responsible for what. Towns then were an extraordinary moment because they really represented the first and clearest indication that the feudal structure was breaking down. Feudalism, as we've seen, developed as a response to chaos. It developed as a consequence of the collapse of central administration, the collapse of the concept of sovereignty, the collapse of law and communication. But with the revival of a money economy, with the recovery of harbors and roads, with the extension of long-distance trade, and with the coming again of a legal system that allowed the law to apply to everyone if it could be properly enforced, then this legal curiosity of the town becomes in fact the indicator, the canary in the mine of historical change on the continent. This, of course, will be the subject of a subsequent lecture, and the importance of it should not be underestimated. What we can see with the rise of the town and the rise of a money economy and long-distance trade and the rise of a legal system and concepts of sovereignty outside of feudal practice is in fact the forces that will change Europe. But nevertheless, before we can do that, we have to look in more detail at the manorial economy to see how that changed and what in fact happened when the introduction of money, something for which the manorial economy was never designed, began to infiltrate. And we can see again that the feudal structure was in fact being worn away. It was being disintegrated by the power of cash and the rise of powerful forces outside the feudal system that could provide alternatives and different kinds of structures based on different models and principles. And that is one reason why the society of the later Middle Ages was so dynamic, because it was a world of tension, but a world, in fact, that produced the sophistication of late medieval society and the coming of the Renaissance.